She was 29, and she had inherited a flood. Not in the poetic sense, in the literal one. The mill at Greyford Crossing had stood knee-deep in its own water since before Cecily Marsh could remember, and now, by the terms of her father's will, it was hers. She had stood in the solicitor's office in Alnwick on a Tuesday in October and listened to Mr. Aldred read the document, with the careful neutrality of a man who had delivered bad news so many times. That bad news had become for him a purely technical matter. The mill, the attached land, comprising 4 acres of waterlogged pasture, and a debt of £11 to the Greyford timber merchant, which the estate, what remained of it, could not cover. Her brother Thomas had received the house, the furniture, the account at the Northumberland Bank, the 2 fields on the South Road that let to a farmer named Gill for £12 the year, her mother's jewellery, which was to be divided between Thomas and his wife at their discretion. Cecily had read that phrase twice and set the will down on the solicitor's desk without comment. She understood discretion. She understood the particular use of it in a household where her presence had always been tolerated rather than welcomed, where she had kept her father's accounts and managed his correspondence and organized his papers for 9 years, and where she had been thanked for it, when she was thanked at all, with the kind of warmth reserved for useful furniture. Her father had not been an unkind man. He had been an absent one, present in body and absent in attention, his mind always in the next field, the next negotiation. He had taught her to read a map, keep a ledger, tell rain clouds by their shape, and she had used all of these in his service for 9 years without his quite noticing. He had tried to correct it at the end. The mill was his father's, separate from the farm lease, owned outright, the one thing he could leave her without Thomas's agreement. He had told her the mill had value, with the conviction of a man who had not visited it in 15 years and whose knowledge of its condition came from a neighbour's remark that the water hadn't moved since the sluice gate failed in 1847. Cecily had been to the mill. She had ridden out to Greyford Crossing in September, before her father died, in the thin autumn light, and she had looked at the standing water, brown still, rimmed with the dark green of permanent waterlogging, and the building rising from it, its lower story submerged to the windowsills, its wheel immovable in a grip of silt and weed, and she had thought, "This is what he is giving me." And she had also thought, because she was her father's daughter and could not entirely help it, why has the water not moved in 40 years? She was not given to sentimentality about difficulty. She had grown up in a house where difficulty was managed, not mourned, and where the correct response to an obstacle was to measure it before you complained about it. So she had stood at the edge of the mill pond in September and looked at the water and measured it. And she had noticed something her father would not have noticed, because her father did not look at things with the patience she had developed over 9 years of looking at everything that crossed his desk. The water was not rising. It was not falling. It sat at exactly the same level it had sat at, she could tell from the dark tide line on the mill's stone, for a very long time. In a natural waterlogging, the level fluctuated with the seasons, higher in winter, lower in summer, responsive to rainfall and drought. This water did not respond. It held its level with the particular stubbornness of water that is being held. Something was keeping it in, and something was keeping it at exactly this height. She had said nothing of this to Thomas. She had said nothing of it to Mr. Aldred, the solicitor. She had ridden back to the house in the fading September afternoon and gone to her father's desk and looked for whatever papers he held on the Greyford mill, the original conveyance, the water rights documents, the maintenance records, anything that would tell her the history of the sluice and why it had failed in 1847 and what the mill had been worth before it failed. The papers were incomplete. Her father had not been a careful keeper of documents relating to property he had not visited in 15 years. She found the original conveyance of 1831, which gave her grandfather title to the mill and its associated water rights on the Grey Beck, and she found a surveyor's note from 1843 that valued the working mill at £65, and she found a letter from the Greyford timber merchant dated 1849, 2 years after the sluice failed, complaining that the flooding had made the access track impassable and requesting a reduction in the rent for the adjacent pasture. There was nothing about what had caused the sluice to fail. There was nothing about any attempt to repair it. And there was nothing that explained why the water, once in, had never moved again. Cecily wrote the £11 to the timber merchant from her own small savings, the money she had accumulated over 9 years of keeping her father's accounts, paid to herself at a rate she had judged, reasonable and recorded in a separate column of the ledger that no one had ever audited, and she arranged with Mr. Aldred to take formal possession of the mill on the 1st of November. She packed 2 trunks, a writing case that had been her mother's, and the ledger from her father's desk that contained 9 years of her own handwriting, and she took the coach to Greyford. She did not look back at the house. She had never found it easy to look back at places where she had not been quite seen. The village of Greyford lay at the bottom of a long valley where the Grey Beck came down from the moor and flattened into a series of shallow pools before finding its course again toward the coast. The mill stood a quarter-mile above the village on the east bank, where the beck made a curve that had, in better times, given the wheel its purchase. The access track ran along the bank and was, as the timber merchant had correctly reported in 1849, in poor condition, rutted, soft at the edges where the waterlogging crept under the stone, and in one place crossed by a fallen alder that had been lying there long, enough to have put out new growth from its horizontal trunk. Cecily arrived in a hired cart driven by a man named Ord, who had the local knowledge to avoid the worst of the ruts and the local courtesy to say very little about the property she was going to. He helped her with her trunks at the point where the track became too soft for the cart wheels, and she carried them the last 100 yards on her own, one at a time, her boots sinking slightly with each step. The mill came into view around the last bend of the track, and she stopped and looked at it. It was larger than she had remembered from September, or perhaps the water around it made it seem so, the building rising from the still brown surface like something that had decided not to drown. The lower windows were below the waterline, their stone surrounds dark with permanent damp. The wheel was a half-submerged ruin, its wooden paddles rotted to stubs, its iron axle seized in a housing furry with weed. Above the waterline, the building was in better condition than she had expected. The roof intact, the upper windows sound, the stonework solid in the way that old limestone tends to be solid, without the need for approval or maintenance. There was a footbridge, a single plank, its far end resting on a stone threshold just above the water level that connected the bank to the mill's upper door. Cecily crossed it with her first trunk, then went back for the second, and then stood in the mill's upper doorway and looked at what she had. The upper floor was a single large room, its ceiling open to the rafters, its floor of wide elm boards dusty but sound. A crane mechanism hung from the central beam, the hoist that had once lifted grain sacks from the carts below to the grinding floor. At the east end, a small room had been partitioned off with pine boarding, a miller's office with a desk, a stool, and a shelf of ledgers whose spines were furred with decades of dust. At the west end, a ladder descended through a hatch to the grinding floor below, the floor that was now under water. She opened the ledger shelf and took each book down in turn. They were the mill's own accounts, production records, customer logs, grain weights and prices going back to 1803, the year the mill had been built. She found the last entry, the 14th of March, 1847, a delivery of 18 bushels of barley from a farm on the North Road, ground and returned. The writing was in a hand she did not recognize, careful and small, the figures precise. Below the entry, in the same hand, A note. Sluice gate cracked. Water rising in lower floor. Sent to Hexham for a millwright. Will close until repair. The mill had not reopened. She spent the first 3 days learning the building. In the office she found the original construction plan, a hand-drawn survey on cartridge paper showing the building, wheel housing, and sluice gate mechanism. She studied it against what she could see from the upper windows. The sluice was on the north side, where the beck entered the mill pond. When the gate cracked in 1847, water had come in. If the gate jammed after, the water would stabilize at whatever height the crack allowed and hold there. 40 years. She needed to see the sluice gate. To see it, she needed to go into the water. She bought a sealed miner's lantern in the village, borrowed wading boots from the blacksmith, and found in the mill's outbuilding an iron pole that had been part of the original sluice mechanism. On the 4th morning, she descended through the hatch into the lower grinding room. The water was at her waist when her feet found the floor. It was very cold and very still, with the particular stillness of water that has not moved in a long time. The lantern held a point of amber light in the brown darkness. She moved toward the north wall, where the sluice housing was, the iron pole ahead of her as a guide and a probe. She found the gate mechanism by touch before the lantern showed it to her. The housing was intact, the stone channel cut for the gate, the iron rails that guided it, all present and solid. The gate itself was jammed in the open position, as she had expected, held there by something wedged against its lower edge. She worked the iron pole along the bottom of the channel until it met the obstruction. It was not a stone. Stones did not have edges like this. Stones did not have corners. She worked the pole against the obstruction for a long time, mapping its shape in the dark water by feel. A rectangle, perhaps 2 feet by 1.5, flat on top and bottom, with a seam around its perimeter that she could feel with the pole's tip, the seam of a fitted lid on a fitted box. She came back up the ladder, wet to the waist, and sat on the upper floor until the worst of the shivering had passed. And then she went downstairs and made tea on the small range she had brought from the village, and thought about what a box was doing at the bottom of the Greyford Mill's sluice channel. It took 2 more days to free it. The box, dark water-swollen wood, banded with iron straps, was heavy and the channel narrow. But on the 2nd afternoon, she floated it to the ladder and hauled it up through the hatch with the rope. On the elm floor of the upper room, she examined it properly. The iron bands were working iron, not decorative, built to keep water out. The seam between lid and body was sealed with pitch and tallow, the compound used on fishing vessels. Whoever had put this box in the water had intended it to stay there. She fetched a chisel from the outbuilding and worked the seal open carefully, respecting what it was, even as she broke it. The lid resisted and then gave. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the water entirely out, were documents. She laid them on the desk in the miller's office one by one. Her hands were still cold, but she made them be careful. There were 6 documents in total. She read them in the order she found them, which was also, she realized as she read, the order in which they had been placed. The first was the Greyford Mill's original water rights grant, dated 1801, signed by the Lord of the Manor of Greyford, and witnessed by the parish constable. It granted to one William Marsh, her grandfather, the right to draw water from the Greybeck for the purposes of milling, in perpetuity the right to be attached to the mill property and to pass with it to any subsequent owner. She had known this existed. What she had not known was what was in the second document. The second was a letter, dated 1831, from the same lord of the manor to a solicitor in Newcastle, discussing the water rights grant, and noting that William Marsh had, in addition to the milling rights, discovered and reported to the manor a natural diversion of the beck that gave the mill pond a secondary feed, subsurface spring in the limestone bed of the valley that maintained the pond's level independently of the main beck. The letter noted that this spring, under the terms of the original grant, was included in the water rights, and that its existence, if more widely known, would substantially increase the value of the mill property, as it represented a reliable year-round water source, independent of drought or seasonal variation. Cecily set the letter down and looked at the water visible through the upper window. The water that did not rise and did not fall, the water that held its level through 40 years of Yorkshire weather, the spring in the limestone bed that she had known in September, was there, had known it from the behavior of the water, from the way it sat at its level with the patience of something fed from below. She read the remaining 4 documents with the steadiness of a woman who has suspected something large and is now confirming it. The third was a surveyor's report from 1847, the same year. The sluice had failed, commissioned, she saw from the letterhead, not by her grandfather or her father, but by the lord of the manor's son, who had inherited the estate. The report assessed the Greyford mill and its water rights, and concluded that the spring, properly developed, could support not only a mill but a commercial water supply for the village, and the 3 farms on the North Road, a supply that the surveyor estimated would command a rental income of £40 to £60 per year. The 4th document was a letter from the new lord of the manor to a Newcastle solicitor, dated 3 months after the surveyor's report, discussing the possibility of acquiring the mill and its water rights from William Marsh's son, Cecily's father, by means of a compulsory purchase order, which would require the property to be assessed at its current working value rather than its potential value. The letter noted that the mill's condition would need to deteriorate significantly before a compulsory purchase could be justified. The 5th was a receipt for payment to a man named Dodd, no first name, no trade given, for services rendered at the Greyford mill, dated 6 weeks before the sluice gate cracked in March of 1847. The sum was £4. The services were not described. The 6th was a note in a different hand, an older hand, she thought less certain of itself, addressed to no one, signed only with the initials W.M. William Marsh, her grandfather. It read, "I know what was done to the gate. I cannot prove it, and I am too old to fight it. I am putting what I know in a place where the water will keep it until someone comes who can use it. The spring is real. The rights are real. The mill is worth what the survey says it is worth. Do not let them have it for less." Cecily read this note twice. She sat for a long time in the miller's office with the 6 documents before her, and the sound of the water outside, and the sound of her own breathing. Her grandfather had understood what had been done to the sluice gate. He had understood the document's value, and he had understood that he could not act on it. Too old, too isolated, without the resources for a legal fight against a lord of the manor. And so he had put the evidence in the one place he could be sure it would be preserved, inside the mechanism that had been sabotaged to destroy him, where the same water that had been used against him would keep it safe. He had put it in the water, and the water had kept it for 40 years. She went to Newcastle 3 weeks later, to a firm of solicitors on Grey Street, whose name she had found in her father's papers as the firm that had handled the original mill conveyance. She brought the 6 documents in the oilcloth, and she brought the 9-year ledger from her father's desk, with her own accounts in it, and she brought the surveyor's report that she had found in the village records office, the public copy, filed as required by law, which the lord of the manor's son had apparently not thought to suppress. The solicitor she was shown to was a man named Mr. Galbraith, 60, thin, with the colouring of someone who spent most of his time indoors reading. He read the 6 documents without speaking. He read the surveyor's report. He asked her when he had finished how she had found the box in the sluice channel. She told him. He asked her how she had known to look for a spring. She told him that also. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the letter from the 4th document, the one discussing the compulsory purchase, was, in his opinion, sufficient to establish that the deterioration of the sluice gate had not been accidental, and that the receipt for Dodd's unspecified services, combined with the timeline, was consistent with deliberate sabotage. He said that the water rights grant, including the spring, was unambiguously attached to the mill property and could not have been separated from it by the compulsory purchase had one been executed. He said that a fair valuation of the mill and its water rights, given the spring's documented output, would be in the region of £350 to £400. Cecily wrote this figure in her ledger under a new heading, Greyford Mill, assessed value, November 1868. The subsequent process took 14 months. The current lord of the manor, grandson of the man who had commissioned the sabotage, and unaware, she believed, of what his grandfather had done, initially disputed the water rights claim through his own solicitors, arguing that the spring's existence had never been formally registered and that 40 years of non-use had constituted abandonment. Mr. Galbraith disposed of this argument with the efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years reading the margins of property law and knew exactly where the other side's case was weak. The original water rights grant was explicit. The spring was included. Abandonment required intent, and there had been no intent. The mill had been flooded by sabotage, and the owner had been unable to operate it. The lord of the manor's solicitors offered £150, declined. 180, declined. 220. Mr. Galbraith told her she could do better. 280. He told her to wait. The final settlement was £310, plus the restoration of the mill's water rights in their full original form, including the spring, registered and unencumbered, attached to the property in perpetuity. It was signed in January of 1870 in Mr. Galbraith's office on Grey Street, by both parties' solicitors, and then by Cecily herself, in the same steady hand she had used for 9 years in her father's ledgers. She did not write to Thomas. He wrote to her eventually, having heard through an acquaintance, suggesting she invest in the South Farm's drainage. She thanked him and declined. What she did with the first part of the settlement, she paid Mr. Galbraith's fee, which was substantial and which she paid without complaint, because a solicitor who does the work deserves the wage. She had the sluice gate properly repaired, a millwright from Hexham, recommended by the same blacksmith who had lent her the wading boots, a man of 50 with an opinion about everything, and a gift for iron that bordered on the artistic. The gate was rebuilt in 3 weeks. The water level in the pond lowered for the first time in 40 years. The wheel housing cleared of silt and weed, and the wheel itself replaced. When the millwright's men raised the new gate for the first time, and the pond level dropped, and the beck ran clear through the channel, Cecily stood on the bank and watched the old water line on the mills. Stone emerged from the retreating water, the dark tide mark of 40 years of standing flood, and she thought of her grandfather, writing his note at the desk in the miller's office, knowing what had been done to his gate, and knowing he could not prove it, and placing the documents in the box with the pitch and tallow seal, and putting the box in the sluice channel, and trusting the water to keep what he could not. He had not known she would come. He could not have known her. She had not been born when he wrote the note, and he had been dead for 22 years, before she stood in the November water, up to her waist with a lantern and a borrowed iron pole, mapping the shape of a box by feel in the dark. But he had built his trust into the mechanism of the thing that had been used against him, and the mechanism had held, and she had come, and the water had given back what it had been, keeping the mill ground flour again in the spring of 1870. The spring in the limestone bed fed the pond steadily through a dry summer that withered the beck to a trickle, and the wheel turned while the other mills in the valley stood still for want of water, and the North Road farmers brought their grain to Greyford Crossing and paid the grinding fee to Cecily Marsh, who kept the accounts in the same steady hand her father had never quite learned to read. By December she had repaired the access track, replaced 2 rotted sections of wheel housing, and begun negotiation with the village council about the commercial water supply that the 1847 surveyor had assessed. The spring could serve the village and the farms on the North Road. She had the calculations in the ledger, laid out in the same columns she had used for 9 years in someone else's house. She sat in the miller's office on a still December evening with the ledger open before her and the accounts running clearly in both directions, expenditure and income, each in their own column, each entered in ink. The range burned. The water outside was at its proper level now, the working level, the level the miller controlled, rather than the level that had been forced upon it. Through the window she could see the wheel housing in the last of the light, and beyond it the beck finding its way south toward the coast, and beyond that the moor going dark against the sky. On the desk beside the ledger was the note in her grandfather's hand. She had framed it very simply in a strip of plain oak cut from the mill's own timber. It hung above the desk now, between the window and the shelf of accounts. She read it sometimes and thought of him sitting where she was sitting, in the same room, writing those words in the knowledge that he could not deliver them himself. Do not let them have it for less. She had not. She had gone into the cold water in November with a lantern and an iron pole, and she had found what had been kept for her. And she had not let them have it for less than it was worth. And the spring still ran in the limestone bed below the valley floor, and the wheel still turned, and the accounts were in order, and the ink did not wash out,